Greetings, City Church and friends of City Church and anyone who may have never been to a gathering at City Church, but you have stumbled across our daily liturgies here for whatever reason. So we're glad that you're listening. What I want to do in the next few moments is focus in on one particular thought and reflection from the Gospel of John in chapter 14 that was just read by Jasmine. When you see what Jesus is saying in verse 1, when he says in 14:1, let not your hearts be troubled. Think about what comes to mind when you think about that. What is Jesus saying? Let not your hearts be troubled. When we think about hearts being troubled, I think things that come to mind are things like our hearts are distressed. The word here in the Greek means that it's stirred up. So this idea of our hearts being stirred up, hearts being anxious, our hearts being nervous. I think all of those ideas convey kind of what is being communicated here to some sense by Jesus. Now, when we think about this exhortation by Jesus to let not your hearts be troubled, I think for a lot of us, we would think that if our hearts are troubled, it is because of sin or because of a lack of faith, or we don't trust God. And it may make us feel guilty or ashamed or bad or frustrated about our faith. Now, there is a way that is true sometimes, but that's not what Jesus is talking about here. What's amazing about this phrase and what Jesus is saying is when you consider it in the context of the Gospel of John as a whole, and particularly chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. In those four chapters, this word troubled is used 5 different times. It's used once in chapter 11, once in chapter 12, once in chapter 13, and then twice in chapter 14. So let's consider what Jesus is saying and how he uses this word in chapter 11, in chapter 12, and chapter 13 to help us understand what he's trying to say to us here in chapter 14, let not your hearts be troubled. So the first time we see it used is in chapter 11, verse 33, where Jesus is encountering the death of Lazarus, and he's talking to Mary and Martha. And in this chapter, we see that Jesus knows that Lazarus has died, and he also knows that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He told his disciples that before he went to the village. And when he saw Martha first, he talked about that Lazarus is going to be resurrected. And so you know that Jesus has the end game in view. He knows that Lazarus is going to be raised from the dead. But when he sees Mary's coming out from the village, and Mary is weeping, and the Jews that are coming with her are weeping. And when Jesus sees them, this is what is described of him in chapter 11, verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. So Jesus was troubled there when he saw Mary and the grief that she had and the sorrow there. And then in in chapter 12, where we see this being described of Jesus again, it's right after his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And at this point, people are praising Jesus. They're saying, they're shouting to him. They are celebrating that he's coming to Jerusalem. But also Jesus recognizes that his arrival into Jerusalem means that the time of his crucifixion has come. And in chapter 12, verse 27, it describes Jesus saying this. Jesus says in verse 27, now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose, I have come to this hour. So Jesus is saying that his own soul is troubled. And then we see in chapter 13, the final time before chapter 14 that this word is used, it is right before Jesus is betrayed by Judas. And when he is telling his disciples near the end of the Passover meal that he shared with them, he says to them in verse 21 of chapter 13, he says, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. So it's amazing here, this amazing picture of Jesus' humanity, that on these three different occasions that Jesus was troubled, that his soul was stirred up, that he was not at ease. And so when we see these things, it helps us understand what Jesus is talking about in chapter 14 when he says, let not your hearts be troubled. Because what was it that troubled Jesus' heart? And what troubled Jesus' heart is that every time he was experiencing things that were a result of the sin that leads to the brokenness in this world, he was troubled. When he was confronted with the death of Lazarus, who he loved, he was weeping in chapter 11, verse 35. And when he sees Mary and her friends grieving, he is troubled by this. When Jesus is confronted with the fact that the people who are celebrating that he is coming into Jerusalem, they're declaring that he is the long-awaited king of David that has come for Jerusalem. That Jesus knows that hours later, the same ones who were saying Hosanna would be saying, crucify him, crucify him. And so his soul was troubled at that how could men praise him in one day and the next day seek his death and crucifixion. And then finally, we see that Jesus was troubled when a close friend of his, someone who he had invested 3 years in, that had been by his side in his ministry for 3 years, was going to betray him, to turn his back on him. Jesus' soul was troubled. And so in all three of these situations, we see that as Jesus experienced the pain of the human life, as he experienced death and the effects of sin and the fall upon the created order, that Jesus was troubled, that he lived these experiences, that they weighed upon him. He was grieved by them, even though he knew that he would be raised on the third day, even though he knew that Judas had to betray him, even though he knew that Lazarus would be resurrected. That in the moment that those manifestations of brokenness and sin and evil were made known, he was troubled. And so here in chapter 14, Jesus knows that he is about to be crucified, that he knows that the disciples have been by his side for 3 years. He knows that they have called him Lord. He knows that they have called him teacher. He knows that they left their vocations to follow him. That when he said, come and follow me, that they did that. He knows that they have forsaken all that they have to be with him. And so he knows that when he is in a few hours going to be falsely accused and be the subject of a sham trial, and that the crowds of Jerusalem are going to be screaming to crucify him, and that he is going to die and to breathe his last, that his disciples are going to naturally wonder, like, what have we done? Like, what has happened here? Like, what have we done with the last 3 years? You know, we've wasted everything, that we thought Jesus was the Messiah. We thought he was truly the Son of God. And yet he's dead. And so he's saying to them, let not your heart be troubled. Now, what's interesting is what he says after that. So let not your heart be troubled. But then he says, believe in God, or trust in God, and believe or trust also in me. So Jesus' exhortation to them is that when you are faced with the reality of evil, when you are faced with despair, when you're faced with uncertainty, when you're faced with the trueness of the experience of living in a world that is not as it should be, Jesus is saying, trust in me. Look to me. Don't hide your head in the sand and act like it's not evil and act like everything is fine. Don't do that. But also don't busy yourselves in such a way that you don't have the time to mentally process what's going on. But he's saying, trust in me. Believe in me. And know that, as he goes on to say in this passage, that I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. These are amazing words that Jesus is saying here. That he's saying that, look, in the troubled life, when you are confronted with things that are going to trouble you, remember that that is not the end of the story. That yes, Lazarus died, but it's not the end of the story. Mary was weeping and grieving, but it's not the end of the story. That the crowds did scream, crucify him, but it's not the end of the story. That Judas did betray Jesus, but it's not the end of the story. All of those things are manifestations of evil and brokenness and sin. But Jesus is saying, don't deny them, but trust in me in the midst of them. They are not the end of the story. I am going to a place to prepare a place for you to return, to come and get you. This is why he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So this exhortation that you can go to the Father through Jesus, that for all of us who know Jesus, we have the hope of that not that we explain away the evil and uncertainty that we face. Our hope is not in that we can explain what's going to happen tomorrow, but that Jesus is preparing a place for us. And so if you don't know who Jesus is and you've never turned to him, that Jesus is saying, if you turn to me and recognize that I am the way, the truth, and the life, then he prepares a place for you as well. I'm thinking about one of the songs that is part of our liturgy today, How Long? And one of the lines in the song reads, do we wait in vain till we see our home descending from the sky? It's a great question. And in times that lead our hearts to be troubled, it's a valid question. But Jesus is saying, trust in me, believe in me. You do not wait in vain. Think about what the psalmist says in Psalm 112, that light dawns in the darkness. Light dawns in the darkness. Trouble will be upon us, that we are experiencing things now that are new to us, unprecedented for us, but not unprecedented for human history. That part of the human experience is that we will face things that trouble us. And Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled, but believe in me. And then later in chapter 14, that he brings us peace, that he says to his people, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid.